In 2023, South African Indians are an integral part of the country's diversity and culture. They arrived in South Africa over a period of multiple centuries. Today, they live in all parts of the country, but the largest population resides in the city of Durban. From unique cuisine and rich cultural practices to religion and sacred traditions, as well as political activism and sporting triumphs, South African Indians contribute a lot to the South African society. South Africans of Indian origin comprise a heterogeneous community distinguished by different origins, languages, and religious beliefs, the majority of whom are the descendants of indentured workers brought over to the Natal province between 1860 and 1911 to develop the sugar industry there. It is well known that many Indian traders were active along the eastern coastline of South Africa long before even the Dutch arrived in 1652, and during the 17th and 18th centuries, over 50% of all slaves at the Cape were Indian from Bengal and South India, taken by the Dutch. A conservative calculation shows over 16,000 slaves having been brought over from the Indian subcontinent. This practice continued until the end of slavery in 1838, and by the 1880s these Indian slaves had totally integrated into the Cape white and colored communities. After the British colonized South Africa in the 1800s, Indian people were brought to work on the plantations, railways and mines of colonial Natal between 1860 and 1911 under the system of indenture, which was basically slavery by contract. Most South African Indians can trace their heritage back to these workers, who came from the Indian ports of Madras and Calcutta. During this period over 150,000 laborers from across India arrived in Natal. They were normally indentured for a period of 5 years, and had the intensive task of cultivating, growing and harvesting the sugar cane. After serving their indentures, they were free to remain in South Africa or to return to India. By 1910, nearly one-fourth laborers returned to India, but most chose to stay and accepted the option of land to start their own ventures. The city of Durban became a thriving Indian neighborhood during the later years of the 19th century. The growing community of workers were catered to by the Indian businesses that were opened in town, selling spices and other necessities. These were mainly operated by the new migrants who arrived in small waves in the country. These later free Indians came at their own expense from India, Mauritius, and other places. The Indian population had grown extensively by the time the 20th century started. Freedom from their indentured contracts allowed workers to integrate into the community, both socially and economically. This, in turn, pressured colonial authorities to restrict the community, as prejudiced settlers were uncomfortable with the change of pace. A large amount of legislation over the period of just over 100 years followed and curbed the mobility, trading rights, settlement patterns, marital choices and educational access of South Africans of Indian descent. In the early years of the 1900s, the republics of Transvaal and Orange Free State passed laws restricting the rights of all Indians to live in areas designated for white residents only. South African Indians were denied the right to vote, to own land, and to run businesses without proper registration. However, the community did not shy away from political activism and rose up against the prejudice and extreme legislation they were facing. With the help of Gandhi, the Natal Indian Congress and the Transvaal British Indian Association were established in 1894 and 1903 respectively, to defend the rights of Indians. With the continued political movements and civil agitations, Indians grew up to become a force to be reckoned with by the 1920s. This struggle against discrimination was a key factor that helped forge a common South African Indian identity, and several cross-racial alliances. The small Indian, colored and white progressive sectors joined with progressive African activists, and together, they conducted a common struggle for freedom and equality. Things got tougher when during the mid-1900s, early apartheid legislation came into effect, which meant that severe restrictions were placed on non-white populations. South African Indians living in Natal were uprooted from their communities and moved 20 to 30 kilometers away to Indian-only townships. Indians and Africans were separated from each other as both the groups had large numbers and could present a threat to the British. In separation, both of these people groups were projected as dangerous to each other. The results were Afro-Indian riots of 1949, after both groups were played by the British. Taking lessons from the unfortunate events, Indian activists took their place with other freedom fighters in the liberation movement during the apartheid years. Many were imprisoned alongside their comrades at the Old Fort in Johannesburg, Durban Central, Ixopo Prison, and on Robben Island. The late President Nelson Mandela and the late Indian politician Ahmed Kathrada fought side by side in the struggle, which eventually ended in 1994 when the first democratic elections took place. It was not all smooth sailing between the Indian and the black communities. Several racially motivated incidents have taken place over the last several decades, sandwiched between good relations of the two communities. Their prevalence might be due to the natural distrust and varying levels of prosperity. The advent of a democratic constitution in 1994, immigration policy restrictions, imposed by the apartheid regime, were scrapped. People from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh arrived in South Africa as new immigrants. However, there is a major cultural division between these new groups and Indian South Africans, which can be expected. Indian influences have contributed to the multicultural diversity of South Africa. The local culinary landscape has been infused with a diverse array of Oriental flavor, most notably in the Natal region. Popular dishes include curry, and an intrinsic Durban dish called bunny chow, which is half a loaf of bread, hollowed out and filled with curry. South African Indians retain a sense of cultural and social connection to India, and a concept of primary local and secondary ancestral identity is prevalent among people of Indian descent. English is spoken as a first language by most Indian South Africans, although a minority of the Indian South African population, especially the elders, still speak some Indian languages. Many South African Indians practice their traditions and social customs, as well as their religion and celebratory festivals. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh and Christian Indians reside in the country, and have dedicated places of worship. One of the largest Hindu temples in the Southern Hemisphere is located in the township of Chatsworth, KwaZulu-Natal. Although some traditional customs are no longer as normalized as they once were, by large South African Indians have remained true to their heritage.